and welcome to the Texas Talks podcast. I'm your host, Brad Swale. Today I'm speaking with Dick Lavine. He's the Senior Fiscal Analyst at Every Texan, an organization that advocates for the better funding and provision of public services. He also served as on the board of directors at Travis Central Appraisal District for more than 20 years, of which the majority was as chairman. And today we're talking about property taxes. So well, that gives people a good idea of your background and why you're qualified to talk about this. Dick, how are you?
Oh, I'm doing pretty well. It's a little rainy out, but otherwise it's good.
It is a little rainy out today. The mist, the fog, it's been kind of weird. You know, we had the hard freeze last week, and now we're wet but not too cold. It's very strange. I'm sure it'll throw us another curveball soon. So I guess briefly, I gave a decent little intro there. Is there something more? Who are you? What do you do? What is that? What is Every Texan?
But Every Texan actually is founded about 40 years ago by the Benedictine Sisters of Boerne, Texas, outside San Antonio, which is a group of Catholic nuns who owned a sort of a nursing home that they sold as they got older. And they used the money to fund various good deeds, including starting our organization. They hired somebody in Austin to try to talk to the legislature about improving health services, which was their main interest. And over time, we've expanded broadly to all health and human services, public ed, higher ed, et cetera. And I came on almost 30 years ago to look at the revenue side of things, because one of the reasons we feel that Texas does an inadequate job is it doesn't have the money. And the money it does have, it doesn't raise in the most fair manner.
Yeah. So, I mean, it's interesting to say that Texas doesn't have the money. People often think of Texas I mean, we just came back from a legislature that had almost $30 billion surplus. And so that's a lot of money. And I think I can't remember what the total budget is, but Texas is thought of as having plenty of money. So what do you mean when that we don't have enough?
No, that's a good point. That right at the moment we're sitting on not only that so-called surplus, but also I think it's about $25 billion in our rainy day fund. But over the course of the last 30 years, it hasn't always been so rosy. In fact, I was working at the legislature in the 1980s when oil prices crashed and our economy and our state budget was much more dependent on oil and gas revenue. And that's in fact when we used to have a 4% sales tax. And in the late 80s, it came up incrementally up to the current 6.25%. And there's a lot of pressure on property taxes also. So I've seen good times and bad times. The idea is that the rainy day fund is fine. It's good to have some savings. But the rest of the money you really need to invest now so that you'll be in better shape in the future. We're no longer as reliant on oil, although you'll have to say oil's been doing pretty well lately. But you want to have a well-diversified economy with a lot of people who are able to find good-paying jobs so they can take care of themselves. That means investments in what we were talking about, health and human services and public and higher ed.
Yeah. So I guess, tell me about property taxes. That's how, Texas funds most of everything that it does, I think, if I'm not mistaken. So we have a property tax system. Where does Texas stand in your estimation on the issue of property taxes?
Well, if you look at all the taxes that are collected in Texas, property taxes is almost half of the total. And the sales tax, state and local, is another third. So we're really just a two-tax state. I mean, we have the oil and gas and the franchise tax and alcohol, all the rest, but it's mainly just sales and property. And of the property taxes, about half go to schools, and the other half is divided pretty much equally between cities, counties, and what we call special districts like community colleges and health districts and whatever. So property taxes are the single most important aspect of our tax system, but it's a state and local tax system. For instance, those school property taxes, as the amount that school districts can collect from those property taxes goes up, not because of rate increases, just because of value increases, the amount the state has to put in goes down because they have guaranteed schools a certain amount per student And if they can raise it themselves, the state doesn't have to put it in. And in fact, if they raise more than a certain amount, they have to give to the state through recapture, through the Robin Hood system, for the state to use to fund other school districts. So it's a single state and local tax system, especially at the school property tax level.
Yeah. How do you feel about the Robin Hood system, the recapture system? It's when I live in Austin, and so we often it seems like every year I see another news article. Austin has sent the most back to the state for recapture. How do you feel about the recapture system? It's talked about being reformed, but I don't know if that's going to happen or not.
Well, actually, I was working for the legislature for 10 years before I came to what's now called Every Texan, which was through all the Edgewood school finance court hearings. And there were a number of different ways that were tried to equalize school funding. The Texas Supreme Court felt that the state constitution did require some kind of equity of school districts able to raise taxes regardless of what their local property wealth was. And at the time recapture was adopted, it affected mainly oil districts, where there were more wells than kids, and here and there, one or two rich suburbs. It's changed over time. I mean, Austin, as you mentioned, is the main donor to the Robin Hood system. And this is a little bit of prejudice on my part, but I think it's because our chief appraiser in Travis County, who we hired when I was chairman of the board, does an excellent job of making sure that all those downtown office buildings that are just sprouting up like weeds in Austin are paying on their full market value. And I suspect, but don't know, that in other big cities, that's not true. I mean, Austin has a lot of property wealth, but you would think that the other big cities would too. And somehow Austin ends up paying more.
Yeah, I mean it is. You're I you're the first person to sort of put it that way, talking about the appraiser, making sure that the downtown businesses. I'm sure there's other businesses there are other properties that they're also looking at, but make sure they pay their fair share, for lack of a better word. And it has always been a little confusing. Why not Houston or a suburb of Houston or Dallas? Those seem like wealthy places. Why
Well,
Austin?
then when I said in the beginning, I think Plano was wealthy, Alamo Heights School District was wealthy,
Absolutely.
but it really was Ira and Sheffield, I remember, way out in West Texas.
Yeah.
But the question is about recapture. Here we are in Austin, generally considered to be a very liberal city, and all you hear is complaints about recapture, because I think there's a valid point, which is Austin doesn't have enough money for its schools. Neither does anybody else. And that's not recapture's fault. It's the fault of the school finance formulas are built on multiples of what's called the basic allotment. Then you adjust for what kinds of students and what kind of school district and et cetera. And it's the basic allotment that hasn't changed. In
Yeah.
fact, the whole point of recapture, the argument was everybody would be in the same boat. So when politically powerful areas like Plano and Elmo Heights at the time needed more money, they would have to get more money for everybody because the system was roughly equalized. But if you may have followed all those special sessions last year, there was the fight over raising the basic allotment, which had fallen way behind inflation since it was last raised in 2019.
Yeah.
Unless you do that, nobody's going to have enough money. Rich districts, poor districts wouldn't matter. They're all struggling along, trying to hold on to their teachers and keep class sizes from getting too big.
Yeah. Yeah. So let's go back to sort of this last session. We did have several special sessions, all of them about schools, or they were advertised about schools, more extra special sessions. Um, so it was announced sometime before the last session that Texas would have, as I mentioned, a near $30 billion surplus. Now, my first thought was, okay, that's a lot of money. I don't know how you guys taxed us so much, but now we have to sort of ask for it back. I don't know if we're going to get it back, if we're going to get all of it or some of it, whatever. And they advertise, the largest tax cut in Texas history. Is that what happened? Did we get a tax cut? What's happening?
We for sure got a tax cut, whether it's the biggest in history, it's an inflation adjusted percentage of what. We never got involved in that. But before we get started, we never use the term surplus
Okay.
because to me, surplus means more than you could use. What it really is, it was an excess cash balance, which is technically how the controller would describe it. And that's because we've been underfunding. We haven't raised the basic allotment. We didn't expand Medicaid, whatever. So the money piled up because we weren't willing to spend it. But once we had all that money and the question came down to, if you're going to do tax cuts, how's the best way to do it? That's when I found myself in agreement with Senator Paul Betancourt. Not natural allies, but we both had the same point of view of, if you're going to cut taxes, the best way to do it is to raise homestead exemption. And that is in large part what they did.
Why is that the best way to do it?
From our point of view, the best way to do the reason that raising the homestead exemption is the best way is because it's an equal dollar amount of reduction for people regardless of their income level. So you have a $300,000 home and you're going to save, I hate to make up a number, but say $200.
Sure.
It was more than that. But that's the same if you have a $300,000 home or a $3 million home.
Yeah.
But obviously that $200 is worth a whole lot more to somebody with a lower priced home, presumably has lower income. So it's a more fair way to reduce their taxes.
Yeah.
We did other things. We cut the rate across the board. That benefits all property taxpayers, including businesses, and incidentally, including landlords. Doesn't mean they're going to pass it on to their tenants, but the landlords are going to be paying less in property taxes. So that we'd rather focus something on the tenants rather than landlords. And I can explain how you do that. It's not quite as straightforward as just cutting the rate.
Well, no, I would love to hear how would you focus on renters, and especially in Austin, the way that Austin has grown, renters sort of being left out in the cold and property taxes going up, their rent goes up. I don't, do renters see that connection? I don't know. So yeah, if you have some thoughts on that, I'd love to hear it.
Well, rent is really, as far as we can tell, pretty much set by market forces.
Yeah.
So huge demand in Austin, price of the rent that's demanded and received is going to go up, even if property taxes are cut. But if you try to get something directly at tenants, you could do it through what's called a circuit breaker. And this is something that exists in the majority of states in one form or another. And it's like an electric circuit breaker, which, if there's a jolt of electricity, it cuts it off before it burns down your house.
Yeah.
Your property tax circuit breaker works is if your property taxes exceed a certain proportion of your income, it's not literally cut off, but it's phased out. And you can also apply that to renters and assume that, say, 15, 20%, you'd have to study it, but something like that of your rent is really just property taxes that the landlord is charging you so that they can pay it themselves.
Yeah.
So you look at your rent, you figure 20% of your rent, you figure what percentage of your income that is. And then the hard part in Texas is figuring out how to get that money back to the tenant. Can you give them a voucher that they can use to pay their rent? You give them, I don't know what. That's the problem is in a state with an income tax, it's easy. You get a tax credit or some kind of refund. We don't have that mechanism. And that's really one of the stumbling blocks is you don't want to have a huge administrative cost that costs more than the benefit you're getting to the renters you're trying to help out.
Sure.
But there should be some way to focus on them and not just an across the board cut that just benefits any and all any property owner.
Yeah. Well, that's interesting. Yeah, I think I'm sure plenty of renters out there would appreciate a voucher to help pay their rent every once in a while. So there's a pro-business wing on the left and the right that really likes Chapter 313. if you could explain a little bit what Chapter 313 was and what it's sort of morphed into with HB5. I'm curious to hear your thoughts about HB5 as well.
All right. Chapter 313 was a program instituted, I can't remember, in 2000. Well, I guess it was a session, so 2001. And what it was is a school property tax abatement for certain businesses. In other words, the way it was set up is if you had a wind farm, which a lot of the projects covered by 313 were wind farms, or a semiconductor plant, or a refinery, whatever it was, you would pay only on a certain predetermined value. So if you put $100 million into it, but it was in a rural area, you might pay on only 10 million, as if it were worth only $10 million.
Yeah.
If you're a big semiconductor plant in Austin, you put in $10 billion, but you'd only be paying as if it were 100 million. I mean, that's a 99% tax cut.
Yeah, not bad if you can get it.
Yeah, it was terrific and very popular among businesses. The way it was done though is they were contracts with local school districts because it was the school district that was giving up the property tax. Now, it didn't cost the school district anything because, as I tried to explain briefly, the school finance system was if they weren't penalized for giving up the value, they were going to get the same amount of money whether they collected on that or not.
Yeah.
So they had no reason to say no. And in addition, they would get kickbacks from the property tax owner, from the project. That they called it sharing their tax savings. So at one point, actually, in this case, I worked with Senator Lois Kolkhorst, another person where we had a certain overlap of interests. I can't say we agreed on much of anything else, but we got along great on this. And she was really a very trustworthy and competent ally in capping the amount of these kickbacks because they obviously distort the decision making. We ended up capping it at $100 per student per year for it turned out about 13 years for these projects. Well, here I've been explaining these school districts are getting systematically starved of revenue. Somebody's coming along, wants a tax break that's not going to cost you any money. It's not like a city or county that if they tax something, they just get nothing for it. School district cost them nothing. They're getting $100 per student for more than 10 years. They said yes. They always said yes.
Yeah.
So it's really a deeply flawed system. And the other thing is a lot of these projects, we're going to come to Texas anyway. I mean, if you're going to build a refinery or liquefied natural gas export terminal, major project. Well, the gas comes out of the ground in the Permian Basin. It goes through pipelines in Texas and it comes to the coast, which we have. They don't need the tax break. Where else are they going to build it, right?
Yeah.
Same thing with wind. The wind blows all over West Texas and also along the coast. We have these huge potential markets in Houston and Dallas and Austin, San Antonio. We have, as everybody now knows, our own grid. So there's no competition coming from outside. So if you want to have if you want to service those big markets with wind power, you're going to build in Texas. You don't need a tax break. You're going to come anyway. So those were our major objections to 313. 313 had a sunset date in it, which was a very positive thing. We think that most tax breaks should have that. So every, however often, 8, 10, 12 years, you come back and you have to look at it. See, is this program still working? Is it still doing what you wanted it to do? Is there a better way to do it? Maybe a cheaper way to do it? We do that for state agencies through the sunset process. We don't usually do it with tax breaks. We did do it in 313 from the beginning. And when it came time to expire in 2021, it expired. And so they had to come back this past session. They wanted a replacement and they came up, which is we call HB5. Its technical name is the Jedi Act.
I feel like there's a lot of Star Wars references in the past.
Yeah, jobs, employment, and Texas, something like that.
Okay.
It was Senator Charles Schwartner came up with it and was very pleased with himself for being so clever. And they just this past week or two came up with the final rules, and they're beginning to accept applications. So it's still a long time before we can see how it works out in practice. But there were two major changes made. One was the elimination of the kickbacks. That was something actually Senator Schwartner was very interested in. So we don't have this perverse incentive for school districts to always say yes. I mean, now they're going to have to actually measure the worth
Yeah.
and listen to their communities. And if their communities don't want some kind of big industrial plant across the street from the high school, they can say so. In the past, there is this conflict in all sorts of school districts about, well, it's $100 per student, we'll give we'll deal with the rest of it. The other thing is this artificial cap that they had in 313, where you never paid more than as if your mammoth project was worth 100 million, or in rural areas sometimes as little as 10 million.
Yeah.
Now you pay on half of its market value, which is a lot more than that 99% I mentioned.
Yeah. A lot more.
You do away with this financial incentive for school districts to say yes. You reduce the amount of the benefit. And there's also, we'll see how well enforced it is, but there is a provision saying that the controller can ask the project to prove that the tax break is what's called a compelling factor in their site selection. In other words, would they come to Texas without this tax break or not?
Yeah.
As I mentioned, for many of these projects, they have plenty of reasons to come to Texas and would have paid their taxes anyway. So we were just giving away the money for nothing. So we'll see how it works out. There's encouraging aspects, the lack of kickbacks and the smaller benefit and the compelling factor test. We'll see.
Yeah, that compelling factor test, I think, will be interesting to see how that pans out. So to kind of wrap up a little bit here, and there's, I'm curious to hear your thoughts on this, especially what should the ultimate goal of the state of Texas be in regards to taxes? Some people, as we established, Texas is it relies very heavily on property taxes, and it's not something that I, am I consuming? I don't know. As a consumer, as a resident, I should say, I can't control really. Does my property value go up and then I get taxed for it? I didn't really do anything. The state of my income could be exactly the same. So there's some disadvantages to it, I think, and there's a lot of people on the right that are trying to move away from property taxes in favor of a consumption tax. Um, just a quick side story. I was talking to my mother about her property taxes. She owns her house outright, and she told me what her property taxes were, and it's in the four digits. So I won't say exactly how much, but it's in the four digits, and I was blown away. I was like, "Whoa! I pay, I don't know, three times that at least." And so I'm 38, and I'm thinking by the time I'm her age and my taxes actually get freezed, I could be paying 40, 50 grand a year in property taxes. And I guess it's cool that it got frozen at that point, but that's a lot of money. Right. So what is the ultimate goal? Like what should the state of Texas be thinking about in terms of taxes and property taxes going forward?
Well, the first thing you said about the fact that you're going to pay these property taxes based on the appraisal district's estimate of what your house is worth, rather than your ability to pay those taxes, is the key point. And an argument we always made in favor of a state personal income tax. You have a bad year, your taxes go down. You have a good year and you can afford to pay more, your taxes go up. If you're being paid on your house and somebody moves in from California across the street and all of a sudden all the value of your whole block goes up, nothing changed in your job, nothing changed in your ability to pay, but suddenly the way our system works, you owe more. That's why we did income tax. But as you know, that's now pretty much off the table because of a constitutional ban that was passed a couple of years ago. So the next thing to do is at least make the property tax system as fair as you can. And it really is a market-based system. And so there's a couple of things you can do. One is sales price disclosure. Most states, when property changes hands and there's a deed filed, the purchase price is reported to the appraisal district. Doesn't have to be made public, doesn't have to be in the newspaper, but then the appraiser has some basis for coming to an accurate valuation of your property. It's like you were going through the checkout line and it was time to scan the barcode, but you covered it up and made somebody guess what the right sales tax was. It's the very same thing. And then there's provisions that's called equal and uniform. Now, we have something in the Constitution saying all taxation should be equal and uniform. We want that. But there is a provision referred to as equal and uniform provision in the tax code, which allows property owners of all types to go in and say, I'm not saying that you have me on the rolls for more than market value. I'm just saying you have me on the rolls for more than the median value of a reasonable number of comparable properties appropriately adjusted. In other words, you're giving other guys a break, and I want the same break. And regardless of market value. And you can tell what happens is, the first guy in gets it lowered. Then the next guy says, well, the median's lower now, so I want mine lowered, which lowers the median, and down you go, right?
Yeah.
Now, it's when you're protesting your property taxes, there's little boxes on the form, and you can check equal and uniform and market value, and everybody should. But the real provision where you figure out the median value, et cetera, is really available only if you're going to go to court. Well, nobody's going to go to court for, unless you're a business or
Yeah.
their home's worth $10 million. So that's something that's just an unfair advantage. And some people are openly paying on less than market value, while the rest of us, especially if you live in a neighborhood like I do, where it's, the houses are similar, there's lots of sales. The appraiser probably has a pretty good idea of how much the thing is worth.
Yeah.
But not for commercial properties, and not if you can afford to go to court.
Yeah.
So
Yep.
one last thing about taxes,
Please.
which is we just came out with a report. It's based on a national research firm that has very complex models of all 50 state tax systems. And so we can see how Texas rates. We turn out to be the 7th most regressive, meaning that if you compare the percentage of income paid by people at the bottom of the income ladder compared to the percentage paid by people at the top, that disparity is 7th worst in Texas. Well, all right. I mean, that's statistical, right? But there's another way we describe it, which is if you look at folks at the bottom 40% of income, which honestly, I don't know what that would be, probably under 60,000 a year. And see what percentage of that income gets paid in Texas, mainly in property and sales tax, and alcohol and cigarette and gasoline, whatever. And you compare that to similar families in California, notorious high tax California, families in Texas pay more because our tax system is so unbalanced and puts so much pressure on folks struggling to make it into the middle class that they are worse off in Texas than they are in California.
Yeah. So I mean, I know that, it would be very difficult to do in Texas. I don't know if it would be impossible, but very difficult at the very least because of the constitutional amendment on an income tax. But would you be in favor of something like a consumption tax, some other consumption tax, or could you see that working out with, let's assume the long-term goals of Texas are to, continue to grow and be business friendly and, provide basic services. And we could argue back and forth. Is Texas really providing basic services? But certainly that's what they would say their goal is. Can property taxes alone achieve that on top of like you said, the myriad of other taxes, or do we need something else?
Well, that myriad of other taxes are mainly consumption taxes.
Right.
Sales tax certainly is, and the cigarette and the alcohol and the gasoline and all the rest. So we already have almost half of our taxes are consumption taxes. And you need some kind of balance. Consumption taxes tend to be pretty volatile. In addition to the regressivity I'm complaining about, because people without a lot of income spend more of that income on taxable items than people at the top who spend it on mainly on services, which aren't taxed, lawyers and stockbrokers and real estate agents and, tennis lessons. I mean, whatever, right?
Yeah.
Or maybe paddleball, maybe. Um, so we already have a heavily consumption tax system. Um, and it goes up and down with the economy a lot more than property taxes do, which tend to be pretty stable over time. It's been odd recently, maybe 2 years ago, my appraisal went up nearly 50%. And when I was on the board of directors, honestly, I never protested. I figured I needed to show confidence in my system. But now I'm off the board, I protested, and I really didn't have a whole lot I could say. Because honestly, my house probably could have sold for 50% more because things were a little nutty. It's settled back down now, but except for odd things like the post-COVID stuff, property taxes, or at least property values, tend to be relatively stable compared to the consumption taxes that can bounce up and down. So you need them both. I mean, most states have what we call the three-legged stool: sales, property, and income, because there's advantages and disadvantages of all three. None of them's perfect, but you balance it out. Well, we only have two, so we'd better at least stick with those two instead of putting all our money onto one. I would say, instead of a stool, you have a pogo stick. It goes up and down. And you do want to fund certain public services. We might disagree on the level, but we know we need to fund something. You need to fund the cops and the fire department. You do need to have schools, you do need to have highways, and you want to be able to fund them year after year.
Yeah. Yeah. I just, thinking back to the story of my mom's frozen property taxes, I don't know. I'm scared to know. I don't know that if I never know what my taxes get frozen at, I think I'll be okay. I'll die happy not knowing.
Well, one more thing about that, because my
Please.
taxes froze some time ago. I'm still working full time.
Sure.
I could pay more in taxes, at least, my ability to pay taxes didn't go down when I turned 65.
Yeah.
Another reason we would like something like the circuit breaker I was explaining that somehow links your property taxes to your ability to pay them. I got a tremendous tax break. My taxes went down 25%, I think I figured. Well, it's because they were catching up on that freeze mainly.
Yeah.
But I could have been paying the prior year's value, the prior year bill year after year, at least as long as I'm working full time. Give the tax break to somebody who's having trouble,
Yeah. Well, that's awfully kind of
young
you.
or old. Just because you're old doesn't mean you can't pay.
Well, you've paid maybe, you've paid for a longer time. You've paid enough, maybe is the argument. But you're right. I guess you could still pay. Maybe that could be tweaked a little bit, but then you'd upset quite a bit of, older people that do have that fixed income, right? That
Oh, sure.
on a
Well,
pension or whatever.
right. If they're trying to make it on just a small pension or Social Security, then they wouldn't have to pay so much.
Yeah.
They have, but if they're living off their investment income or they're still working full time and they have the money, they should be paying. The people without the money, which should be paying less.
Yeah. Well, Mr. Dick Lavine, senior fiscal analyst at Every Texan, I really appreciate you taking the time. I enjoyed the conversation and the education. Is there you want to share your website, or if you're on social media, your
Yeah,
social?
our website is www.everytexan, all spelled out one word, .org. And there's lots of stuff on there. Stuff
Yeah.
about the budget and taxes, health and human services, education, lots of stuff.
Yeah.
And I'm still active on what I still refer to as Twitter. And so you can follow me as D Lavine. It's DLAVINE. And I put stuff up every day. I check in on Twitter every day. I still, especially with hashtag TXLege,
Yeah.
TXLEGE, I still find it pretty usul. And, you
Oh,
know,
it's
I have
very
feelings about Elon Musk, but I have feelings about Mark Zuckerberg too. So, you know.
we all have feelings for these people, but you know, we're there anyway. Well, thank you so much for taking the time. I really appreciate it. We'll put the link
Yeah.
that down in the description below.
Yeah, thanks for inviting me on.